March 1982, NBC Studios, Burbank. The monologue had ended, the audience was settling, and Johnny Carson turned toward camera 2 with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 4,200 times before. But then his eyes moved, not toward the guest chair, not toward the band, somewhere past the lens, into the shadows where producers stood with clipboards and stopwatches. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades of near-perfect broadcast rhythm, Johnny Carson stopped talking. The silence lasted 4 seconds. In the language of live television, 4 seconds is an eternity. The studio audience, trained by years of watching him, sensed something had shifted. The laughter didn't fade, it simply ceased, replaced by the hum of air conditioning and the faint mechanical whir of cameras waiting for instruction. Ed McMahon, seated just off camera left, later recalled feeling his chest tighten, unsure whether to laugh it off or lean in. Doc Severinsen, who had seen Carson navigate every conceivable mishap with a raised eyebrow and a pivot, sat motionless behind his trumpet. This was not a bit. This was not a pause for effect. This was Johnny Carson, the man who made 30 million Americans feel like they were in on the joke, suddenly looking like he wasn't sure what the joke was anymore. To understand what that silence meant, you must first understand what Johnny Carson had become by 1982. He was not simply a television host, he was the gatekeeper. The Tonight Show was the last stop before fame, the first stop after scandal, and the only stop that mattered if you wanted America to forgive you, believe you, or buy your book. Politicians appeared on Carson not to debate policy, but to seem human. Actors came not to promote films, but to prove they could think on their feet. Comedians knew that 6 minutes on Carson's couch could mean a career, and 6 minutes that died could mean obscurity. Johnny Carson did not grant interviews. He did not explain his choices. He simply sat behind that desk every weeknight, shuffling his blue index cards, and decided who America would trust. And America trusted him. Not because he was warm. Carson was famously remote, even to those who worked with him for years. Not because he was radical. His politics, if he had any, were kept behind the curtain with the precision of a magician guarding a trick. America trusted Johnny Carson because he was consistent, because he never seemed desperate, because when the world was loud and fractured and uncertain, Johnny Carson was there at 11:30, composed and in control, making it all seem manageable. The monologue cards in his hand were not just cue cards, they were a symbol of order. As long as Johnny had the cards, the show would go on. As long as the show went on, so would everything else. But on this particular night, something had gone wrong before the cameras even turned on. The guest scheduled for the first segment, a young actor promoting a film that would later be forgotten, had arrived late. Not fashionably late, not stuck in traffic late, the kind of late that suggested either arrogance or disaster, and in the world of live television, the distinction didn't matter. The segment producer, a woman named Shirley Wood who had been with Carson since the New York days, had made a decision in the hallway 30 minutes before airtime. She pulled the actor. Not bumped to another night, pulled entirely. There would be no second invitation. In the hierarchy of The Tonight Show, you did not disrespect Johnny's time. You did not disrespect the crew's time, and you certainly did not assume that your face on a movie poster mattered more than the machinery of the most watched program in America. But this created a problem. The show was live to tape, meaning it recorded as if it were live, with no stops, no edits, no room for hesitation. Pulling a guest meant filling 7 minutes of air with something, anything that would not make Johnny look unprepared. Wood had scrambled. There was a backup guest, a comedian who had been on the show before, someone reliable, but he was not in the building. He was 20 minutes away, stuck on the 101 freeway, and there was no guarantee he would arrive before the second commercial break. So Wood made another decision. Tell Johnny during the monologue. Slip him a note. Let him know he'd have to stretch, vamp, do what he did better than anyone. Make it look effortless. Except Johnny Carson did not receive the note. In the controlled chaos of live production, someone assumed someone else had delivered it. And when Johnny finished the monologue, took his seat and looked toward the wing where the first guest should have been waiting, he saw no one, just a stage manager with a headset, frozen, and Shirley Wood standing in the shadows with her arms crossed, already calculating damage control. That was when Johnny looked off camera. That was when he stopped talking. And that was when 30 million people watching from living rooms and dorm rooms and hospital waiting rooms leaned forward without knowing why. Fred DeCordova, the show's executive producer and the man responsible for maintaining Carson's trust through 16 years of television, would later describe that moment as the only time I saw Johnny genuinely uncertain. Not angry, not panicked, uncertain. DeCordova had seen Carson handle broken props, forgotten punchlines, guests who froze on live television. Carson's genius was not in avoiding disaster, it was in making disaster look like part of the plan. But this was different. This was a breach in the structure itself, the invisible agreement between Carson and his producers that he would never be left alone on camera without knowing what came next. The audience did not know what was happening, but they knew something was. A man in the third row would later tell a local reporter that he thought Carson was having a medical episode. A woman near the back said she assumed it was a prank, that Burt Reynolds or Don Rickles would burst through the curtain any second. But the silence stretched, and Johnny Carson, who had spent 2 decades making America comfortable, looked deeply uncomfortable.
Ed McMahon did what Ed McMahon always did. He laughed. Not a real laugh, a test laugh, the kind meant to give Johnny an opening, a way back into rhythm. Johnny turned toward him, and for a fraction of a second, there was something in his eyes that almost no one ever saw. Irritation. Not at Ed, at the situation. At the failure of the machine he had helped build to run smoothly without him having to think about it. And then, because he was Johnny Carson, he turned back to the camera and smiled. "Well," he said, and the audience exhaled. "This is live television, folks." It was not live television. It was taped. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that Johnny had given them permission to laugh, and they did, louder than they had all night. He leaned back in his chair, tapped the desk twice with his index finger, and looked toward the wing again. Still no guest, still no explanation. But now he had control again. "We had a guest scheduled," he continued, "but apparently he's renegotiating his contract." The audience roared. The band played a sting. And just like that, the moment was over. Not erased. Anyone watching carefully could still see the tension in his jaw, but reframed, turned into a joke, made safe. The backup comedian arrived 4 minutes later, breathless and apologetic, and Johnny pivoted into the interview as though nothing had happened. The episode aired 2 days later. No one watching at home knew that the first guest had been pulled. No one knew about the missing note, the frozen stage manager, the 20-second silence that had felt like an hour. It simply looked like Johnny Carson, doing what Johnny Carson did. But inside Studio One, something had shifted. Shirley Wood, who had worked with Carson longer than almost anyone, later admitted she thought she might be fired. She wasn't. Johnny never mentioned it. But 2 weeks later, a new rule appeared in the production manual. No guest changes after 6 p.m. without Carson's direct approval. The monologue cards, always a symbol of structure and control, became even more sacrosanct. Johnny would sometimes hold them during commercial breaks, tapping them against the desk, a quiet reminder to everyone in the room that the show ran on precision, not luck. The desk itself, that iconic piece of furniture, simple and modern and utterly unadorned, had always been more than a place for Johnny to sit. It was a boundary. Behind it, he was untouchable. Guests sat beside it, never behind it. Even during sketches, even during chaos, the desk remained his. And when something went wrong, when the machinery of the show faltered, Johnny would often reach out and touch it, grounding himself, reassuring the audience that he was still there, still in charge. On the night he stopped talking, he tapped the desk twice. Not out of nervousness, out of necessity, to remind himself and everyone watching that the structure still held. Years later, after Carson had retired and the analysis of his career had become an industry unto itself, television historians would point to moments like this as evidence of his mastery. Not because he handled it perfectly, though he did, but because he allowed the audience to see, just for a moment, that the perfection was work, that the ease was constructed, that Johnny Carson, for all his authority, was still at the mercy of the same forces everyone else was. Miscommunication, bad timing, the unpredictability of live performance. And in that brief glimpse of uncertainty, he became more trusted, not less.
This is the paradox of Johnny Carson. He was most believable when he was most human, but he was most human when the machinery failed. And so the machinery was engineered never to fail. The Tonight Show was not a variety show. It was a precision instrument, calibrated to Johnny's rhythms, his pauses, his tolerance for chaos. Every guest was pre-interviewed, every story was vetted, every surprise was planned. And yet, on the rare occasions when something genuinely surprised him, a guest who went off script, a joke that bombed, a missing actor, the audience saw the real Johnny Carson, the one behind the desk, the one who had been a magician before he was a host, and who understood that the most important trick was never letting them see you sweat. But on this night, they saw him sweat, or at least they saw him pause. And in that pause, the illusion cracked just enough to reveal what held it together. Not charm, not talent, but discipline. The discipline to turn confusion into comedy. The discipline to trust that the audience would follow him anywhere as long as he kept moving. The discipline to tap the desk twice, smile, and make 30 million people believe that everything was exactly as it should be. The monologue cards remained in his hand. The show went on. And Johnny Carson, who had stopped talking when the script ran out, began talking again the moment he wrote a new one. When Carson retired a decade later, the moment was not mentioned in retrospectives. It was too small, too inside, too dependent on understanding the machinery to appreciate the breakdown. But those who were there, the crew, the producers, Ed McMahon, remembered it. Not because it was dramatic, because it was honest. Because for 4 seconds, Johnny had no plan, no punchline, no exit. And then, because he was Johnny Carson, he found one. The desk, solid and unchanging, remained. The cards, shuffled and discarded, were filed away. And the audience, watching from home, never knew how close they had come to seeing the gears stop turning. They only knew that Johnny had paused, smiled, and kept going, which was, in the end, the only thing that mattered.